Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She was found in her bathroom, burned, alone, surrounded by the bodies of her beloved pets. But the fire didn't kill her. It was a bullet to the head, and whoever did it tried to erase every trace of her. The fire chief's wife was murdered. The fire chief himself was first on scene, and 8 years later, no one has been charged. This is the story of Nanette Crentel, a quiet woman, a violent end, and a case Louisiana still can't close. It was a sweltering Friday afternoon, July 14, 2017, in Lacombe, Louisiana. The kind of southern heat that clings to your skin, settles into your lungs, and dulls the edges of everything. By 2:30 p.m., the only sounds in the wooded lot off Ruelle Court were the shriek of cicadas and the sudden crackling of fire. A two-story home was burning fast. The flames had already punched through the roof, and smoke funneled up into the pine trees like a signal flare no one wanted to see. The property belonged to Steve and Nanette Crentel, and the first responders arriving on scene knew exactly who they were working for: their own fire chief. Steve Crentel wasn't just any public official. He was the chief of fire services for St. Tammany Parish, a 25-year veteran, respected, known, trusted. So when his home was found engulfed in flames, the response was urgent but unusually personal. According to incident logs, multiple firefighters and sheriff's deputies responded. Steve was notified immediately and arrived minutes later. The fire was already tearing through the structure, but containment started quickly. In the garage, vehicles were intact. Bedrooms were compromised but not gutted. The worst damage seemed concentrated in the living room and kitchen. But then came a call from the second floor. "We've got a body." Back bathroom, doors closed. They found Nanette Crentel, 49 years old, face down, badly burned, lying near the tub. Her body was still in position, no signs of struggle, no effort to crawl, no attempt to escape, just her, and around her, 6 dead cats, 1 dog. All had succumbed to the smoke and heat. On paper, it looked like tragedy, possibly even suicide. A woman overwhelmed, isolated, grieving something no one else had seen. But the thing about fire is, it hides things, but it also reveals them. As standard procedure, Nanette's body was removed and sent to the St. Tammany coroner's office for post-mortem examination. The fire marshal began routine arson protocol. Steve Crentel gave an initial statement. It was emotional, if brief. He'd been at work. He had no idea. He couldn't understand what had happened. But even in those early hours, deputies noticed a few things. The fire had started in multiple locations: living room, hallway, near the back door. That wasn't typical. There were no signs of forced entry, but also no clear accelerant trails left due to how quickly the fire had been suppressed. Security cameras? Disconnected. The house had no active monitoring system, and Nanette's behavior, according to family, had been off. She hadn't answered calls that morning. She had canceled appointments earlier in the week. Her father had received a troubling email just days prior. "I don't feel safe here anymore," she wrote. "Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched." Still, there was no hard evidence of foul play yet, no visible bullet wounds, no clear signs of homicide. It would take a few more days before the autopsy findings turned everything on its head. But even before that report came in, there was tension among the investigative team. One firefighter reportedly said to a deputy, "It just doesn't sit right. Why was she in the bathroom with the door closed, and she never even tried to get out?" Another deputy off the record commented, "The scene's too clean, and that's what bothers me." It didn't help that Steve Crentel, by virtue of his position, had unusual access to the site. As fire chief, he knew protocols, he knew how fire moved. He understood how quickly evidence could be damaged or destroyed. Whether that meant anything wasn't yet clear. But in cases like this, proximity and familiarity create problems. Not always criminal ones, but optical ones. Forensics would need to speak louder than assumptions. And on July 17th, the autopsy did just that. By the time Nanette Crentel's body reached the St. Tammany Parish coroner's office, 3 things were clear to local authorities. The house had burned quickly, the fire had multiple points of origin, and the victim was found in a location with no signs of escape attempt. But it wasn't until the forensic pathologist began the external examination that the investigation took its first irreversible turn. On July 17, 2017, 72 hours after the fire, the official cause of death was no longer hypothetical. The autopsy revealed that Nanette Krentel had died from a single gunshot wound to the head, a contact wound just above the right eyebrow. The projectile entered at close range and did not exit. There was no evidence of soot in the trachea or lungs. She never inhaled the smoke. She was already dead when the fire began. This wasn't a tragic accident or a woman overwhelmed. This was homicide. Forensic teams performed a full-body X-ray. No additional projectiles or fractures were found. There were no defensive wounds, no abrasions, no broken fingernails. Toxicology screens came back negative. No alcohol, no sedatives, no controlled substances. The body was badly burned, but the trajectory of the wound remained identifiable. The burn damage complicated external assessments, but the core injury, the gunshot, was unmistakable. The next layer of questions focused on time of death, which was estimated between 10 o'clock a.m. and 1 o'clock p.m. The fire call came in at approximately 2:15 p.m. That meant the shooter had time to kill, to stage, and to leave. No signs of forced entry, no burglary, no ransacking, no signs of struggle inside the home. The victim was still clothed. The bathroom door had been closed. All animals in the house had perished. None were moved. That detail would later trouble one of the arson investigators. If this was someone Nanette knew, they didn't even open the door to let the animals out after killing her. That says something. Despite the presence of 6 cats and a dog, no animal hair was found embedded in the front hallway, suggesting that the killer may have entered and exited through a different point, a back door or garage. The report also noted the fire's intensity was greatest in 2 places, the living room and the hallway leading to the master suite. Fire accelerant detection was attempted but inconclusive due to suppression methods. No distinct accelerant residues were found, but the burn pattern was consistent with intentional ignition at more than one site. According to the fire marshal's preliminary report, the fire appeared to have been used to obscure physical evidence. From a procedural standpoint, this discovery shifted the investigative mandate. This was no longer an open-ended cause of death determination. It was a homicide scene. But the homicide scene had been compromised. At the time the autopsy report was delivered, the house had already been cleared, partially bulldozed, and considered unsafe for further on-site investigation. Evidence that might have been captured, footprints in soot, partial fingerprints on door handles, foreign hairs, was unrecoverable. The decision to treat the scene as an accident in the first 24 hours now cast a long shadow. The weapon was never recovered. A detailed grid search of the surrounding property yielded nothing. The coroner noted the projectile remained lodged in the cranial cavity, making ballistics analysis impossible without excavation, which could not be performed due to the extent of thermal damage and ethical restrictions from the family. Still, the report made the cause and manner of death explicit. Cause of death, gunshot wound to the head. Manner of death, homicide. Once that finding was released, the sheriff's office publicly confirmed that they were treating Nanette Krentel's death as a criminal act. Behind the scenes, however, the complications were mounting. The individual most closely tied to the scene, Steve Krentel, was both the husband of the victim and the fire chief overseeing the initial response. Any investigatory involvement he had during those early moments could now be scrutinized as a potential conflict of interest. A detective with over 2 decades in homicide later commented privately, "When a body is found in a burned house, you expect the smoke to have left a trail. This one didn't. Just a bullet, no casing, no gun, no noise complaints, nothing." Digital records from inside the home were limited. No working security system had been active at the time of the fire. Cameras had reportedly been installed in the past, but by the summer of 2017, they'd been removed or disconnected. There were no smart locks, no alarm triggers, no motion-activated alerts that survived the fire. The family submitted Nanette's iPad and phone for forensic imaging. Initial logs showed regular usage until the morning of the incident. Her last outgoing message was a brief reply to her father at 9:03 a.m. After that, digital silence. The time gap between her last confirmed activity and the ignition of the fire aligned with the estimated time of death. She was likely shot in that window between 9:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m., and the fire set shortly afterward. For investigators, the conclusion was simple. The killer had time, access, and familiarity with the layout of the home. But as the days unfolded, the biggest problem wasn't the crime. It was the credibility of the response. In small towns, hierarchy and personal ties run deep. And in a case where the victim was the fire chief's wife, and the fire chief had been first on the scene, the optics were already compromised. The data aligned too cleanly, one officer later noted. Sometimes that's the problem. As public interest grew, authorities began to feel pressure, not just to solve the murder, but to prove they were even capable of investigating it objectively. When a woman is murdered inside her own home, investigators typically start close. And in the case of Nanette Krentel, the person standing closest was her husband, Steve Krentel, the fire chief for St. Tammany Parish. It was Steve's house, Steve's wife. And Steve was first on scene, overseeing the fire response that recovered her body. From the outside, that level of proximity demanded attention, but inside the command structure of St. Tammany's emergency services, Steve wasn't just a name on a report. He was the highest-ranking fire official in the parish. That complicated everything. The day of the fire, July 14, 2017, Steve was officially on duty. According to verified records, he had clocked in at the administration building that morning and remained there throughout the early afternoon. Log entries showed he was attending internal meetings and desk work. He wasn't at the scene when the fire started. Dispatch records and radio traffic confirmed his response was reactive, not proactive. Still, his timeline was subjected to scrutiny. The sheriff's office pulled GPS records from his department vehicle. Location pings aligned with his statement. He had not returned home at any point before the fire was reported. No deviation from expected routes. Phone records showed no outgoing calls from Steve to Nanette that morning. There were no voicemails, no messages. For some, that was confirmation he couldn't have committed the crime. For others, it raised a different question. Had someone else done it for him? Interviews with colleagues painted Steve as reserved but respected. He had over 25 years in the department and had worked his way up. But within the weeks following the fire, internal affairs investigators received unconfirmed information. Steve had been engaged in an extramarital relationship, and Nanette had recently confronted him about it. This revelation wasn't part of the initial timeline. It didn't change the facts of the fire or the cause of death, but it did change the context. Nanette's fears, the ones she had documented in her journal and mentioned to her father, took on a different dimension. She wasn't just feeling unsafe. She was watching the man she loved become someone she couldn't trust. Detectives interviewed Steve twice in the first month. According to transcripts, he denied any involvement in the fire or Nanette's death. He admitted to the affair. He said Nanette was struggling emotionally, but denied she was suicidal. He offered his full cooperation and voluntarily provided fingerprints, a DNA sample, and his digital devices. Those devices, his phone, work tablet, and desktop computer, were imaged by the forensics lab. Analysts found no evidence of communication with Nanette in the 24 hours before her death, and no searches or messages suggesting intent to harm. GPS data remained consistent. No deletion apps, no timed shutdowns, everything aligned. Too neatly, according to one investigator. It was all there, but the gaps weren't filled. They were just empty. That's what got to me. The fire itself posed another problem. As fire chief, Steve had not only access to standard training and suppression, he had working knowledge of fire behavior and origin points. He would have known what accelerant fires looked like. He would have known how easily fire could erase key evidence, especially if no one expected it to be a crime scene. But investigators could not prove that knowledge had been applied. No fingerprints were found on accelerant containers, no video surveillance, no eyewitnesses seeing him anywhere near the home before the fire. His co-workers stated he was visibly distressed on scene, and yet the optics remained damaging. When a man oversees the fire that destroyed his own home, discovers his own wife's body, and is revealed to have been cheating on her in the weeks leading up to her death, questions don't go away, especially not in a parish like St. Tammany, where departments work closely and reputations are personal. Despite all that, By August 2017, Steve Krentel was officially removed from the list of active suspects based on the corroborated alibi and lack of forensic evidence tying him to the murder. Still, investigators remained cautious. No one publicly exonerated him. His statements were re-reviewed multiple times over the years. The investigative files from the sheriff's office included multiple tabs labeled possible concealment of evidence, fire knowledge. None of it led to a charge, but none of it disappeared either. In December 2017, Steve spoke to reporters briefly. He said he wanted answers as much as anyone. He said he missed Nanette. He said he didn't know who could have done this, but as of 2025, he remains the only person with access, motive, and confirmed knowledge of how fire moves and how it erases. Some truths are buried not beneath ash, but beneath what should have been tracked and logged, data, timestamps, signals, and on July 14, 2017, the one signal that could have answered everything went dark. By this point in the investigation, Steve Krentel had been extensively questioned and tentatively cleared. His GPS history aligned with his timeline. Phone pings, work surveillance, and even third-party testimonies held up. His affair was no longer in dispute, but it didn't place him at the scene. Investigators needed a new direction, and they found it by looking at a man who hadn't stepped inside the house that day, but whose past had already been allowed in. Brian Krentel wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He was Steve's brother, Nanette's brother-in-law, and he had a record. He'd recently been released from prison and was reportedly struggling with addiction and anger. But it wasn't just his criminal history that made detectives turn their attention toward him. It was what Nanette had told people in the weeks leading up to her death. She was scared of Brian, not in a vague, cautionary way, but specifically. According to close friends and a handful of family members, Nanette had expressed serious concerns. She claimed Brian had sent her disturbing messages, including direct threats. Among them, threats involving arson. This wasn't just idle paranoia. She'd mentioned him watching her. Unfamiliar vehicles on the road outside. Surveillance footage in the days before the fire confirmed multiple sightings of a gray sedan in the area, consistent with Brian's car model. That might have remained circumstantial until the moment investigators pulled his GPS logs, or rather, tried to. On July 14, 2017, the very day Nanette was killed and her home set ablaze, Brian's GPS unit stopped transmitting. It had functioned normally up until 8:37 a.m. After that, it went dark. Completely. To be clear, GPS units don't just go dark. They don't randomly lose signal in suburban Louisiana on a clear morning. And when they do, it's either a mechanical failure, environmental interference, or a manual shutdown. The manufacturer later confirmed the unit had not malfunctioned. This was an intentional disruption. Investigators obtained his vehicle's diagnostics and confirmed the system had been physically disabled, not jammed or glitched. Someone had pulled power. The shutdown window coincided with the same time frame in which the fire at Nanette's home was likely started, around 10 o'clock a.m. That wasn't the only data anomaly. Phone records showed Brian's mobile device was in use on July 13th and again on the evening of July 14th. But during a 6-hour stretch, from mid-morning until early afternoon on the 14th, there were no calls, no texts, no data usage. Cell tower data placed him somewhere between Slidell and Lacombe, but it wasn't precise enough to pin him at the property. Then came the interview. When detectives questioned Brian, he denied visiting the house. He acknowledged the GPS failure but chalked it up to a weird glitch. As for the threats Nanette had mentioned, he claimed they were exaggerations. He was, in his words, getting clean and focused on moving forward. But investigators weren't convinced. They knew Nanette's fear hadn't been performative. She'd spoken of him repeatedly. She'd warned people that if anything happened to her, he should be looked at. And now, the only piece of technology that could have cleared or condemned him had gone conveniently offline. Still, there were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance placing Brian near the house on the morning of the fire, and Louisiana law doesn't allow prosecutors to move forward based solely on implication and timing gaps. Forensic teams did re-examine the burn pattern inside the home, especially the origin points of ignition. Multiple accelerants were used, evidence of a calculated burn. not spontaneous combustion. This aligned with someone who had knowledge of how to destroy a scene quickly and completely. But Brian had never worked in fire services. That skill set fit someone else. Investigators found themselves in a bind. Steve had motive, Brian had opportunity, and both had direct or indirect connections to Nanette's fear. The case, already politically fraught due to Steve's position as fire chief, began attracting scrutiny from outside advocacy groups. Transparency requests were filed, emails were subpoenaed, and for a moment, it seemed public pressure might force the case open further. But no arrest came, not then, not now. I keep coming back to one question that isn't about tech, timelines, or testimony. If a woman says she's in danger and names names, what does it take for someone to listen? July 14, 2017 had ended in smoke and silence. By the next morning, investigators faced a crime scene already compromised. The fire had consumed the home of Nanette Krentel, and with it, many of the answers that might have once lived in that house. But one question pressed harder than the rest. If Nanette died from a gunshot wound, where was the bullet? It didn't take long for forensic examiners to confirm what the autopsy had hinted. Nanette had not inhaled any smoke. She was already dead before the first flame was lit. The absence of soot in her lungs, paired with the trajectory of the bullet wound to her head, made one fact unshakable. This was no accident. At that point, the investigation shifted into high gear. One of the first targets of renewed interest was Brian Krentel, Steve's brother, recently out of prison. Nanette had told multiple family members she feared Brian. Specifically, she said he had threatened to burn her house down. Now, with that exact scenario realized, the suspicion was no longer theoretical. Detectives requested Brian's GPS tracking data from his vehicle. It had been consistent until the morning of the fire. At 9:02 a.m., the signal disappeared. It remained offline for nearly 4 hours. That absence overlapped precisely with the window of time when Nanette was likely murdered and the fire ignited. Brian claimed it was a technical glitch, but forensic teams couldn't verify that. The GPS unit was later found in working condition. Phone records showed no outgoing calls during the outage. Investigators quietly flagged this timeline as critical, but without a witness or a camera putting Brian at the scene, it remained circumstantial. Meanwhile, Steve Krentel, husband and fire chief, had not been cleared, just deprioritized. He had access to the property. He had keys, knowledge of her schedule, and motive whispered in the margins. Rumors of an extramarital affair had circulated for months. Some members of Nanette's family believed she was preparing to confront him. Others suspected she already had. His alibi was time-stamped at the firehouse, backed by logs and surveillance. Still, eyebrows were raised when it became clear that Steve had overseen the firefighting response to his own burning home. That decision, while technically allowed, blurred the line between personal crisis and professional command. The crime scene was poorly preserved. Multiple responding officers later admitted they walked through the home without protective gear. Key evidence was likely destroyed, not by the fire, but by human error. Adding to the complexity, an accelerant had been used. Investigators recovered melted remnants of a plastic gas container near the bathroom door. Burn patterns indicated at least 3 separate ignition points. The fire was no longer just suspicious, it was confirmed arson. Public trust began to erode. Citizens of Lacombe started asking uncomfortable questions. Was the investigation compromised? Was the sheriff's department protecting one of its own? Anonymous tips flooded in, many of them unsubstantiated, but one recurring claim stood out: the belief that local law enforcement didn't want this case solved. By August 2017, the FBI had been quietly looped in. They conducted a parallel review of digital evidence, phone records, tower pings, deleted messages. One discovery stood out. Brian Krentel had attempted to call Nanette 6 times between July 9th and July 13th. None were answered. None left voicemails. But one call pinged off a tower just 2 miles from the Krentel residence, 36 hours before the fire. When questioned again, Brian claimed he was just passing through. That explanation didn't sit well, not with detectives, not with the family, and certainly not with Nanette's father, who had been keeping meticulous notes of every development, or lack thereof. The deeper the investigation reached, the more unstable the ground beneath it became. One brother-in-law with threats and a missing GPS signal, one husband with motive and proximity. No arrests, no charges, just a burned home, a dead woman, and a town running out of patience. There was something deeply unsettling about the silence in that GPS report. Investigators had spent weeks poring over the digital footprint of Brian Krentel, Nanette's brother-in-law, a man who had once been imprisoned for theft, then released, only to reportedly threaten Nanette repeatedly after her refusal to welcome him back into family life. She had told her relatives he'd promised to burn the house down. She hadn't exaggerated. The GPS unit he kept in his truck, part of his probation monitoring, had sent consistent updates every 30 seconds for over 6 months, until July 14, 2017. That day, just after 9 o'clock a.m., the signal vanished. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a technical hiccup. It was a deliberate loss of data. The device had been manually disabled. This was no longer a speculative thread. The disappearance of a digital signal aligned within the same hour, Nanette was believed to have died, and the fire ignited. For the first time, detectives had something resembling a timeline, not just a gut feeling. But here's what they didn't have: surveillance footage, confirmed sightings, or physical DNA from Brian at the scene. When questioned, Brian claimed he had been doing errands and forgot his phone at home, a statement hard to verify and too conveniently timed. He expressed surprise about the fire. He offered condolences. He deflected, but he never outright denied having threatened Nanette. The statement was recorded but inconclusive. Meanwhile, arson specialists returned to the ruins of the Krentel property. Though days had passed since the blaze, they continued examining the burn patterns, specifically the origins of the 3 flashpoints. They confirmed that the fire had started in separate, strategically distant zones: the living room, the laundry room, and the master bedroom hallway. Accelerants were detected in all 3. That was rare. Random house fires didn't behave like that. The presence of gasoline residues, still detectable even after fire suppression, confirmed what many feared. This had been a coordinated ignition, likely set in under 5 minutes by someone who knew where to strike. The fire had been staged to spread quickly, destroy evidence, and eliminate the only living witness, Nanette's dogs, found dead in their crates. And Nanette? Autopsy results had already made it clear. She was shot once in the head, execution style, no soot in the lungs, no defensive wounds. The trajectory and depth of the bullet wound were consistent with close-range assault. Detectives now believed she was murdered in or near the master bathroom, then left, while her killer moved through the house with a gas can. But the moment investigators thought they had a breakthrough, procedural chaos struck. The lead detective on the case was abruptly reassigned, and the forensic team's access to the fire department's internal logs, specifically those concerning Steve Krentel's movements on the morning of the fire, was temporarily revoked due to a pending administrative review. The reason? Alleged conflict of interest, given Steve's rank as fire chief and his familial link to both the victim and a suspect. Tensions escalated. At this stage, the FBI had taken quiet interest. Not a takeover, but a review. An agent from the New Orleans field office requested to observe evidence logs and scene reports. Their interest reportedly was not just the homicide, but the possibility of local obstruction. Meanwhile, Nanette's father, Dan Watson, made another public plea. But this time he wasn't asking for justice. He was accusing the parish of protecting its own. He brought forward a letter Nanette had written just months before her death, one that had never been shared publicly. It wasn't a diary entry or a vague complaint. It was addressed to a friend and detailed her growing concern about being watched, the presence of a tracker under my SUV, and a mention that Steve knows more than he says. It wasn't enough to name a killer, but it was enough to reopen the question that had lingered from the start. Who truly benefited from Nanette's death? The inheritance structure wasn't extraordinary, no sudden windfall, no million-dollar policy, but there was something else. Nanette had recently been pushing for an internal audit of a charitable account tied to the fire department's fundraisers, something she privately called a black hole of receipts. She had access, she had questions, and she was, by all accounts, not someone easily silenced. But now she was. The fire had taken her voice. The bullet had sealed the silence. The digital trail, however, especially the GPS void, was still speaking, and it was pointing somewhere no one in St. Tammany Parish wanted to look directly, inward. Before the chapter closed, a new request was filed by federal investigators, this time for cell tower triangulation records of Brian's phone, not just on July 14th, but for the days prior. If a pattern emerged, if someone had been casing the property, then the silence in the GPS wasn't an endpoint. It was a beginning. There's a specific moment in many unsolved homicides where the trail simply vanishes, not fades, not erodes, vanishes. For investigators working the Nanette Krentel case, that moment came once all avenues of direct evidence were accounted for, and nothing concrete emerged to connect the known suspects to the sequence of actions that ended in her murder and the fire that followed. It wasn't for lack of evidence, it was for lack of will. Or at least, that's what some on the inside began to whisper. We were now months past July 14, 2017. The fire scene in Lacombe, Louisiana had long been cleared. The Krentel home reduced to blackened debris. But what should have been the anchor for a strong homicide case, a body, a clear cause of death, multiple potential suspects, a destroyed crime scene, was instead becoming a swamp of procedural missteps. Let's revisit what the forensics told us. Nanette died of a gunshot wound to the head. No soot in the lungs, no thermal damage to soft tissue. That placed time of death prior to the fire. Arson investigators determined accelerants had been used. Deliberate fire setting, likely intended to destroy physical evidence. This wasn't a suicide. This wasn't an accident. It was a targeted act of violence followed by destruction. But when detectives began retracing movements, timelines, and digital footprints, new cracks began to emerge. Steve Krentel, the husband and fire chief, had been cleared based on station logs, security footage, and time-stamped radio dispatches. His alleged affair was acknowledged, but no evidence tied it directly to motive or opportunity. Some investigators remained skeptical. Chiefs know how to work around systems, after all. Still, without a direct link, he remained legally outside the perimeter of suspicion. Attention returned to Brian Krentel, Nanette's brother-in-law. Fresh out of prison at the time, Brian had allegedly sent her threatening messages and had previously mentioned burning it all down in an argument. But when pressed for data, the only promising lead, the GPS monitoring bracelet, failed at the worst possible time. The signal cut out hours before the fire. A malfunction, a tampering, no one could say for sure. When the signal returned, Brian was back in his designated residence. But that blackout window overlapped the murder and fire almost exactly. You could feel the tension in the sheriff's office. Detectives weren't just working a homicide, they were swimming against a current of internal friction. This wasn't just a murder scene, it was a potential conflict of interest. Steve's position in the local fire service and his proximity to parish leadership complicated every move the investigators made. Some officers suspected quiet pressure to avoid aggressive pursuit of leads that might touch political nerve centers. Others were simply too demoralized to keep pushing a wall that wouldn't budge, and yet despite all of this, the community kept asking, family members kept calling, independent journalists kept reporting. The question wouldn't die. Why, in a case with a body, a confirmed bullet to the head, and an intentional fire, had no one been arrested? One particularly damning misstep became public late that year. It was revealed that several key pieces of evidence from the scene, including potential trace materials from the bathroom where Nanette's body was found, had been moved or compromised before being logged. One investigator off-record described it as a complete breakdown in crime scene protocol. Others weren't surprised. The fire department had access to the house before law enforcement arrived, and some items had already been cleared before investigators took over. It was by then too late to rebuild the chain of custody. A chilling truth became clearer. The loss of evidence didn't happen naturally. It happened structurally, from within. At this stage, even those closest to Nanette, her father, Dan Watson, began publicly stating his concern that local officials had no intention of solving the case. In interviews, he didn't name names, but he didn't have to. The implication was enough. Someone was being protected, or someone was being ignored. Narratively, The story remained unbalanced. There was violence, there was motive, there were suspects, but there was no movement forward. And here's where that familiar frustration takes hold for many true crime watchers. We want resolution. We expect consequence. But the Nanette Krentel case wasn't moving toward closure. It was standing still, frozen by institutional fatigue, legal caution, or something darker. We can't say for sure. What we can say is that a woman was killed, her body burned, and that every system meant to deliver justice had failed, one step at a time. There was one remaining hope, though. In late 2018, federal authorities quietly began reviewing parts of the case, prompted by pressure from Nanette's family and questions around jurisdictional integrity. A new set of eyes, a new level of scrutiny. Whether that would lead to anything remained unclear, but it was more than had existed for over a year. And so we arrive at a point many homicide cases fear, when nothing can be done unless someone talks. By 2019, the local investigation into Nanette Krentel's death had stalled. Despite public pressure, no arrests had been made. Under mounting scrutiny, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office passed the case to federal authorities. The FBI's review was methodical. They re-examined autopsy reports, fire scene photos, GPS data, and internal agency emails. One thing was clear: the integrity of the original scene had been compromised early on. Entry logs were inconsistent. Crucial items had not been preserved. Investigators noted the timeline had already been muddied, something that would haunt every future review. Steve Krentel, Nanette's husband and fire chief, remained a controversial figure. He had access, a strained marriage, and a known extramarital affair. While his alibi at work was time-stamped and verified, inconsistencies in his early interviews, particularly his shifting timeline of last contact with Nanette, raised flags. But there was no physical evidence tying him to the shooting. Brian Krentel, Nanette's brother-in-law, had a clearer motive. He had made threats. His GPS tracker mysteriously lost signal on the day of the fire. Still, federal agents found no weapon, no forensic link. His phone activity provided no usable data. Without hard evidence, the U.S. District Attorney declined to prosecute. Independent journalists later uncovered internal documents suggesting oversight failures. One body cam, believed to be off, had recorded partial footage, but it only captured the aftermath, not the scene in its untouched state. In 2021, the FBI quietly closed its file. Nanette's father, Dan Watson, was notified by phone. He died 2 years later, never receiving the justice he fought for. To this day, no one has been arrested. Nanette's murder remains unsolved. Her story is more than a cold case. It is a symbol of how investigative failures, blurred agency lines, and unspoken loyalties can fracture public trust. It raises uncomfortable questions about who is protected and who is left behind. But memory is a form of resistance. Through every vigil, every name spoken aloud, Nanette is not forgotten. She is more than a statistic. She is a warning and a call for accountability that still echoes. No one ever expects justice to be delayed this long. And when it is, when answers never come, it changes the way you see everything. If there's one thing I've learned from Nanette's story, it's this: never assume the system will speak for the voiceless. We have to be the ones who demand clarity, who keep asking the uncomfortable questions, even when the silence gets louder. What do you think went wrong in this case? Could it happen in your own hometown? If this video moved you or made you think, leave a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. If you didn't enjoy it, I'd love to hear why. Either way, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next true crime deep dive.